You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth. Hey!
Spanning the globe to bring you the latest developments in medical cannabis, adult marijuana, industrial hemp, and spiritual ganja.
We love the herb.
It's time for the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville. Now, here's your host, Russ Belville.
Good day, tokers and tokettes and non-toking lovers of liberty. It is Tuesday, November 28th, 2017, and it's got to be 420 somewhere in the world. Thanks for joining us, and we're really excited about today's show because we got good news to deliver in the form of surveys, polls, and legislation. Most notably, to the north of us in Canada, where the House there has passed a bill to begin the process of legalizing cannabis for all adults in Canada. So we'll tell you a little bit about that coming up in the cannabis headline news. Also in the news today, a story that didn't make the news cut, but I just wanted to mention it. There was a note about federal prosecution leading to 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for a former Seattle police officer who was involved in a trafficking ring to smuggle marijuana from Seattle to Baltimore. And normally I'm not for anybody getting any sort of mandatory minimum sentence for providing marijuana to adults who want to buy it. But if you were someone who used to bust people for providing marijuana to adults who want to buy it, I might be able to look the other way on that one. Yeah, the irony alert is way too high on that particular case. Also, that leads me to what we're going to talk about in What in the News. We're going to get a little bit deeper into the Canadian legalization and take a look at prohibitionist carpetbaggers, the former law enforcers and politicians who were against marijuana legalization, who fought marijuana legalization, who put people in jail for doing what we're trying to legalize, who then go and try to get a license and make money on the legal green rush. We'll talk about that coming up right after the headline news. Also on the show today, in A Sensible Future, we're going to replay an interview with Kat Murti, an SSDP alum who's going to talk about how students in the organization Students for Sensible Drug Policy can continue their reform efforts after they graduate college. And then in the Radical Rant, we're going to take a look at the new rules for Oregon's medical marijuana grow sites, the limits on plants that you're allowed to grow, which once again show how ridiculous it is to try to set up plant count limits for medical patients. That's all coming up today on the Marijuana Agenda. But first, let's get to the cannabis headline news.
This is your Cannabis Headline News. Brought to you by MarijuanaMoment.net, the complete source for all your marijuana news in one morning newsletter from Marijuana Majority Founder Tom Angel. Subscribe today for free at MarijuanaMoment.net.
This is your Cannabis Headline News for Tuesday, November 28th, 2017. I'm Russ Belville. Members of Parliament in Canada passed the Liberal government's bill to legalize cannabis Monday night by a vote of 200 to 82. Attempts by Conservatives in Parliament to delay the bill were unsuccessful, but their colleagues in the Senate in the Tory party vowed to delay the bill for fear that its implementation deadline of July 1st, 2018 is too soon to provide ample study and debate of the plan. The Conservatives would prefer legalization to begin 1 year later in 2019. During debate on the House bill, a 100-centimeter height limit for homegrown cannabis plants was struck down for being too difficult to enforce, and a 1-year deadline for cannabis edibles and concentrates regulations were approved. The bill also sets limits for single-use cannabis products, including a 1-gram limit for pre-rolled cannabis cigarettes, 10 milligrams of THC for cannabis edibles, and 30 milligrams of THC per milliliter of cannabis concentrate. The bill allows people age 18 and older to possess up to 30 grams of cannabis and grow up to 4 cannabis plants, but that age may be adjusted upwards by the provincial governments. A new survey from the Property Casualty Insurers Association of America, or PCI, finds that only 40%, of Americans believe marijuana use is contributing to more crashes on the roads, compared to 92% who blame distracted driving. Data show that the country has experienced its worst 2-year increase in auto fatality since the 1960s, leading PCI Senior Vice President Robert Gordon to state that, quote, driving under the influence of marijuana should be viewed with the same risks as drunk or distracted driving, end quote. Survey respondents seem to have a better grasp of reality, however. One recent study has shown that drunk drivers are 17.8 times more likely to cause a fatal crash compared to the 1.65 times risk for high drivers. Another study shows that once data are adjusted for age and gender, high drivers were no more at risk for a crash compared to buzz drivers at 0.05 BAC with twice the crash risk and drunk drivers at 0.08 BAC with 4 times the crash risk. Texting drivers split the difference between buzzed and drunk drivers with over 3 times the crash risk. In an interview with the San Francisco Chronicle, Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard noted how pharmaceutical, alcohol, and tobacco companies thwart efforts to end adult marijuana prohibition. Quote, "For years, Big Pharma has played a major role in preventing cannabis research by lobbying Congress for more stringent and outdated cannabis regulation laws, as well as partnering with tobacco and alcohol special interest groups to fund anti-legalization campaigns," end quote, said Gabbard. The Hawaii Democrat added that marijuana's Schedule I classification has, quote, "made it nearly impossible for medical experts and scientific researchers to fully explore the use of cannabis in treating a number of health conditions," end quote. Gabbard has introduced House Resolution 1227, the Ending Federal Marijuana Prohibition Act, which she says, quote, "would take marijuana off the federal schedule of controlled substances, decriminalizing marijuana and freeing up banks from current FDIC restrictions that prevent them from doing business with the cannabis industry," end quote. As we covered in yesterday's edition of the Marijuana Agenda, police in Hawaii are sending letters to registered medical marijuana patients demanding they voluntarily surrender their firearms and ammunition. The letter explains, quote, that under provisions of Hawaii Revised Statute Section 134-7A, medical marijuana use disqualifies you from ownership of firearms and ammunition, end quote. The police further tell patients that within 30 days they must, quote, voluntarily surrender your firearms permit and ammunition to the Honolulu Police Department or otherwise transfer ownership. The National Rifle Association, the nation's leading Second Amendment rights organization, has issued no public statement on the letter. A new poll conducted by Emerson College finds that 62% of New Yorkers support the legalization of marijuana. Even 53% of New York Republicans support the idea. The poll, commissioned by Drug Policy Alliance and Marijuana Policy Project, also found that legalizing pot was the only policy supported to address New York's $4 billion budget deficit. Voters strongly opposed increasing income taxes, raising sales taxes, cutting education or public service funds, or raising highway and bridge tolls. This has been your Cannabis Headline News for Tuesday, November 28th, 2017. I'm Russ Belville.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville. The Marijuana Agenda is a listener-supported independent podcast brought to you by Radical Russ Media, LLC. Subscribe to our VIP feed at mjagenda.com for access to our ad-free podcast segment archive. Make a one-time donation to support the Marijuana Agenda at paypal.me/radicalruss. The Marijuana Agenda. Like the gay agenda, only with better music.
Looking for the 420 friendliest way to visit beautiful legal Potland, Oregon?
I'm Lori Duckworth, inviting you to come stay with us at Delta 9 House and Studios.
You get your own private room with queen bed and access to our high-speed Wi-Fi, premium entertainment system, and more.
We'll even cook you breakfast. Look us up on Facebook at Delta 9 House.
That's facebook.com/Delta9House. Delta 9 House is booked through Airbnb.com. City of Portland permit number 17-159855.
People should say no to drug use.
It's really, really easy.
Adding more gasoline to the fire.
Lackadaisical.
Really tough, really big, really great.
To infect and rot our nation from within.
Dangerous and gateway drugs.
We don't need to be legalizing marijuana.
To build and grow a stronger, healthier, and drug-free society.
In the news.
I want to talk about two subjects today in What in the News. We'll get to the Canadian prohibitionist carpetbaggers in a second, but I want to start with this survey on the texting and driving versus driving under the influence of marijuana. This is the survey that was put out by the Property Casualty Insurers Association of America. And the way they frame the survey is that, oh my God, we're not warning people about how dangerous marijuana and driving are. Only 40% of Americans think it's dangerous. And only like 30%, some odd percent of parents are telling their kids it's dangerous compared to all the other stuff that we think is dangerous. Why? The people think drinking and driving is dangerous. They think texting and driving is dangerous. They think social media and driving is dangerous. Distracted driving is dangerous. But for some reason, they just can't wrap their mind around marijuana being that dangerous. Well, maybe it's because they know it's not that dangerous. Now, we always have to put the disclaimer in these talks, and that disclaimer is nobody should drive a vehicle when they're too impaired to drive it. That's just no matter what it is, whether you're on OxyContin, cannabis, anger, having sex while driving, whatever it might be, you shouldn't be driving in a situation where you're too impaired to drive. But where the difficulty comes here is assessing what is too impaired to drive. And where I get frustrated about this is because we as a society have established a standard when it comes to alcohol. We have said that so long as you're not over 0.08 with your blood alcohol content, you may not be too drunk to drive. Now, you can still get a DUI under 0.08. Then you see those signs around town that say buzzed driving is drunk driving. If you're driving in a manner that seems to be impaired, you fail a roadside sobriety test, it doesn't matter if you come up 0.08 or not, right? They can still bust you at 0.02 or 0.03, right? But by having a 0.08 standard that says below this, you are not per se too impaired, we have to prove that you were too impaired. It establishes to me that we accept a certain amount of impairment. We do. We accept a certain amount of impairment. According to one of the studies I looked up for this story, buzzed drivers, that is people at 0.05 to 0.08, right? Not quite over the drunk driving limit, but they're above 0.05. From 0.05 to 0.08, you got twice the crash risk. Over 0.08, you got 4 times the crash risk. So to me, it seems we've accepted that you can be impaired enough to be half as effective a driver, right? Twice the crash risk, half as safe. You're allowed to be half as safe as long as you're drinking alcohol. So to me, I think that a way that we should be determining what the standard should be is that we should be taking a whole bunch of high drivers and a whole bunch of texting drivers and everybody else for that matter, whatever condition you want, and they should have to compete against drivers who are at a 0.05. And if you can do better than a driver who's at a 0.05, you should not be per se impaired. That is, you're texting, you're smoking pot, whatever it might be. If you're not as bad as someone at 0.05, you're below what we consider to be too impaired. But that's not what people like PCI and the driving people want it to be. They, instead of having an absolute standard, want to have a relative standard. They want to say that if you've done anything to make yourself more impaired, you ought not be driving. That is, if you can't be 100% as good a driver as you should be, if you impair yourself down to 99%, then you were irresponsible and got yourself impaired. Never mind the fact that the drinker is allowed to go from 100% to 50%. Never mind that. Anything else, if you're below 100%, we don't want you. But even that doesn't seem real to me because we still allow cars to have radios, to have drink holders, to have navigation systems. Those certainly are distracting people, aren't they? So we also tacitly accept when it comes to distracted driving, there's a certain amount that we find acceptable. So these studies, PCI and these AAA has done this as well, where they're trying to raise this hue and cry about stoned drivers being a big problem, is running into reality. And that is, people been smoking and driving for years, for decades. And we haven't seen the massive crashes outside of Woodstock or massive road wrecks in Haight-Ashbury back in the day, right? We don't see major traffic crashes outside of Fish concerts, right? I mean, if there was going to be some problem with smoking weed and driving, we'd have seen it by now. And what they're trying to do, they're trying to raise this alarm because they look at the stats that show over the past 2 years, crash rates have gone up dramatically. And that's not just more drivers. That's on a per million miles driven basis. So crash rates have gone up. But there's so many factors. A lot of speed limits have gone up. We've had some states that have changed the ages and the requirements for which you can get a driver's license have made that easier. And what I would consider to be the greatest problem, a massive increase in car electronics, in navigation apps, in texting. I really believe that is the primary driver of this, pardon the pun, of this increase in the auto fatality stats. So let's get away from this stone driving is a big problem, because every study we've conducted so far has shown that when you adjust for age and gender, it's either no difference from a sober driver or a negligible difference from a sober driver. Now, about Canada, let's get back to that for a second, because the Canadian Parliament has passed this bill for cannabis regulations. Thank God they struck down the 1 meter cannabis plant limit. They were seriously proposing, the Liberal government was seriously proposing you could grow 4 cannabis plants, but none of them could be over 1 meter tall, 100 centimeters, about 39 inches, right? How ridiculous is that? What are you supposed to do? Start chopping the top off your cannabis plant if it keeps pushing that 1 meter limit? If it's still in veg state, hasn't yet flowered yet, what are you supposed to do? I mean, thank God they struck that down. They realized how ridiculous that was. But the problem I've got with what's going on with legalization in Canada has more to do with who's trying to get rich off of it. And there's a story that came out recently in Reuters that highlighted, and I've been following this also. I've been following this also from the social media feeds of Mark and Jody Emery up in Canada. But this police chief in Toronto, I forget the guy's name, major prohibitionist, legalizing marijuana would be like legalizing murder. You know, one of these dyed-in-the-wool, reefer-mad prohibitionists who's now turned another leaf, again, pardon the pun, and is trying to get involved in the cannabis business, trying to get licenses, medical licenses in this case. But we've seen this happen throughout the United States, too. I reached out to a number of my activist friends across the states, across the legal states, who all have tales to tell of former regulators, lawmakers, law enforcement who are jumping onto the legal cannabis bandwagon. And it's bad enough these people supported, propelled, or worked under prohibition, locked people up, sent them away, wrote the laws that ruined people's lives, supported the laws, opposed reforming those laws. It's bad enough those people are trying to get in and make money off of this. But what's worse is because of their connections with government, they've got the inside track. They've got the inside track on getting those licenses. They got a leg up on the people they had previously been busting. And I don't know how we address that. I would love there to be some sort of clause written into the law. And I don't know Canada's constitution. I know this wouldn't constitutionally work in America, probably wouldn't work in Canada, as far as restraint of trade or equal protection of the laws, whatever it might be. But wouldn't it be nice if into this legalization, we could write what I originally called in 2012 the I-502 pledge. Back then, it was when I was fighting the stoners against legalization, the people on our side who didn't want it legal. And I came up with the I-502 pledge, which was anybody who is publicly advocating against I-502 should be barred from getting a license that allows them to profit off the passage of I-502. We should do the same thing now in Canada and all across the states that are legalizing. There ought to be a law. There ought to be a regulation that says if you voted for prohibitionist laws or voted against repealing those laws, or ever prosecuted, arrested, sentenced, jailed, or guarded someone for violating a pot law, you don't get a pot license.
I think I was trying to suggest something about the duality of man, sir.
I wish it could be so. It makes me feel like Lieutenant Aldo Rain, you know? Wishing there was some way that we could permanently mark those prohibitionists so they can never, ever get into the cannabis industry. Never, ever profit. Maybe some legal eagle will think of that. When we come back, we've got Cat Murti and A Sensible Future. If you work in the cannabis industry, consume marijuana, or just support freedom, you need to know about breaking policy news that affects you. Marijuana Moment is the daily newsletter that helps you stay on top of all the latest and most important state, federal, and international cannabis developments. Brought to you by longtime legalization activist Tom Angel, Marijuana Moment puts a concise yet comprehensive overview of cannabis news in your inbox early every weekday morning. Wake up to Marijuana Moment and rest assured you'll be ready for the cannabis news that's driving the day. Subscribe now at marijuanamoment.net.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
It's like I picked the wrong week to quit smoking.
Learn more at mjagenda.com.
The International Cannabis Business Conference is headed to Hawaii. Get your tickets now for the year's best cannabis industry island retreat this December 1st through 3rd. Kauai Grand Hyatt hosts the 3-day ICBC, which begins with a VIP reception featuring cannabis comedian Doug Benson. The ICBC features exhibitor booths, keynote speeches, and informative panels with industry experts and regulatory officials. Then, when it's all said and done, kick back for the incredible after party with music by reggae legends Morgan Heritage. There's also a singles golf tournament you can play on Monday, sponsored by Leafly Endured Ventures. Log on to internationalcbc.com to get more information and buy your tickets now. Special discount hotel rates are in effect, so act fast. That's internationalcbc.com for the International Cannabis Business Conference. Aloha.
Now, in the interest of fair and balanced journalism, the Marijuana Agenda presents this anti-drug public service announcement.
Great time at the party you hosted, but I'm kind of embarrassed because I didn't realize you felt that way about me.
Party was great. But I should explain I'm currently seeing someone, but if that changes, maybe we can get together.
Getting unusual feedback from your company this year? It's because you serve Corona. No other beer says how much you love your guests better than serving Canada's #1 premium import beer. And until December 31st, Corona is offering special savings on 6-packs at the LCBO and the beer store.
Corona Beer, ethyl alcohol, is for adults age 21 and older. Please use responsibly. Side effects of alcohol use may include drowsiness, hyperemesis, diarrhea, gastrointestinal discomfort, headaches, difficulty breathing, impaired judgment, slurred speech, decreased perception and coordination, anemia, and amnesia. Long-term use of ethyl alcohol has been associated with firearm injuries, sexual assault, domestic violence, hypertension, stroke, heart attack, cirrhosis of the liver, impotence, brain damage, cancers of the mouth and throat, and in some cases, fatal episodes. Talk to your doctor before consuming Corona Beer, especially if you're taking prescription medications such as opioid painkillers, as severe, possibly fatal drug interactions can occur.
Hey Bob, it's Phil. Corona Extra. I love you too, man.
This has been an actual anti-drug public service announcement. To combat this and other drug war hysteria, listen to the Marijuana Agenda every weekday at 3 p.m. Pacific at live.mjagenda.com or download the free podcast at mjagenda.com. The Marijuana Agenda free podcast is available on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, TuneIn, Google Play, SoundCloud, and on our Facebook page at MJ Agenda. Free video archives are available at the Radical Russ channel on YouTube. Help keep this media free by making a donation at paypal.me/radicalruss. The Marijuana Agenda. Like the liberal agenda, but with profits. Ka-ching.
New beginner guitars and banjos are often constructed much better than ones built before your time. Why struggle? Get a new instrument or fix the old one. The trusted professionals at the Fingerboard Extension will evaluate your instrument for free. Repairs are priced for people who work for a living. Stop by the Fingerboard Extension downtown Corvallis at 120 Northwest 2nd Street today, or check out its inventory on the web at fingerboardextension.com.
This is A Sensible Future, brought to you by Students for Sensible Drug Policy at SSDP.org. Drug policy is an issue that primarily affects the young, both in terms of use and legal prosecution. SSDP believes in honest education about drugs and advocates for harm reduction policies to protect young adults and society at large. We speak with another dedicated activist from SSDP, working toward a sensible future.
Welcome to this episode of A Sensible Future, the podcast for Students for Sensible Drug Policy. I'm Russ Belville, and joining us here for the podcast today, we have Kat Murti. She's a board member and longtime SSDPer. How you doing, Kat?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Russ.
Oh, so glad to have you. So when did you get started with SSDP?
So I actually got started in January of 2009. And I got started because, I kept hearing about SSDP on my campus. I went to UC Berkeley, and I thought, hey, why not? Let me get involved with these people who are working to end the drug war.
That's excellent. So attending UC Berkeley, was it just your freshman year that you'd heard about them?
So this is actually my last year of school. I heard about them in 2008, towards the end of 2008, so in January of 2009. Oh, I guess it wasn't my last year. It was my next last year. So 3 semesters to go, I decided to get involved. And I got to tell you, I've been super involved ever since then. So it's clearly a good decision.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you were just finishing up school and just getting involved with SSDP and now you're still involved, it shows to people listening out there, this isn't just about college students, correct?
Right, definitely. I mean, we are a student organization, and we're very grassroots, so our chapters really do have a lot to do with what goes on with the organization. But we have college campuses. We even have a couple high school chapters now. And, we have this massive network of SSDP alumni and folks who got involved even a little bit later after school.
I am well aware. I have many people that I talk to through the podcasts that I produce that have graduated from SSDP and moved into consulting or other nonprofit organization work. And I think SSDP presents a perfect launching pad for people that are getting involved in these kind of reform efforts. Now, Kat, as far as you getting involved, you said you'd heard about SSDP. Was there anything that compelled you to get involved? I mean, sometimes some people get busted or they get sick, and that compels them to get involved. What was your motivating factor?
Well, I can tell you on my side of things, I was really looking for an organization that was working to end the war on drugs, something that I was personally quite passionate about. The criminal justice system is just a wreck. And when I was in school, not even college before that, I saw a number of people going through the school-to-prison pipeline. Once you get into the system, it just drags you back in and back in and back in. And I was lucky that I was able to escape that. But I saw it happen to so many people. And what I kept seeing as one of the factors that came up again and again was a lot of times folks were getting busted with half of a joint or something like that, and that would be the first time that they would get pulled into the system. So it was definitely a huge problem that I saw, and it was something that I wanted to address. I wanted to work to end the drug war, and, I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and when I was there, I joined the DFW Normal chapter, but when I looked around on campus at Cal, I didn't see anything similar. So when I started hearing about SSDP, I knew that was the group that I should join, and I'm glad I did. Part because they really do address, all drugs, but also just the larger criminal justice problems and justice in general.
I'm glad to hear that you're also from Texas and had worked with the DFW Normal chapter. That's one of the finest normal chapters in the country. And to go from Texas to Berkeley, California had to be quite a culture shock, I imagine.
Well, actually, I went because of the culture. I was looking at a few different schools, and I visited Berkeley with a friend of mine. And when I got there, I just fell in love. I was a pretty politically active kid growing up. It was, I'm a libertarian. I've been a libertarian since I was a young teenager, and I've always been quite active politically. And so Berkeley, I heard all these stories, and then when I went to campus and I saw what the culture was like there and how involved and how much people cared about it, I knew that was the place I wanted to be.
Well, that's great. It sounds like then you got involved with SSDP from a very political, ideological standpoint. So you get through college at Berkeley. How did you stay connected to SSDP after graduation? What was your next role?
Yeah, definitely. So in college, I joined the chapter, and then soon after I became the chapter president, and I started interning at the SSDP office. So, that definitely made me a big part of the network, and going to conferences and going to events and working with other chapters kind of built up that friend group for me. So that certainly helped a lot. And then when I left college, it was something that opened the door for me on my resume, having that there and talking to jobs about that. And it was also just this network. I moved across the country to D.C., so I knew SSDPers already, so those were the only folks that I knew in town. And then, we had a lot of opportunities to keep working. I was trying to get involved setting up something to help folks like me who were SSDP grads and were looking for jobs, so we set up kind of like an unofficial SSDP network around that. I got involved with what is now our DARE committee, and don't worry, that is a joke. It's the Diversity, Awareness, Reflection, and Education Committee.
Much better DARE, if you ask me. Much better.
Right. It's a DARE about actual issues, not just made-up government propaganda. And so, so it's just one thing after another. So I've been chairing that committee for about 5 years now. We've done a lot of work to try to make SSDP and the drug policy reform movement more open and accepting. And in the meantime, I petitioned to join the board. I applied to join the board on the basis of, all of this great work that we were doing with DARE. I wanted to be on the other side of that and really bring a lot of that to the board as well. And then a couple years ago when we formed the Board of Trustees, I decided to be one of the founding members of the Board of Trustees as well. So now I actually sit on the board, and I'm vice chair of the Board of Trustees.
Wow, great job. You've just risen through the ranks of SSDP. And for someone out there who's listening to the podcast, who's wanting to get involved with SSDP, how do they follow your example? I mean, can they start their own chapter if one doesn't exist at their college?
Yeah, actually, it's super easy. You just reach out, just Google us, or look at ssdp.org. We have something called the Campus Ambassadors Program. So even if we just have one student on a campus who really wants to get involved, we start you off as an ambassador, and then we have these awesome outreach directors who will really help you figure out what you need to do on your campus to get folks started. So then we'll slowly help you scale up to the point where there is a chapter, including helping you reach out to other folks who might be in your area at different campuses on chapters, or if we know that, hey, actually there's 3 people from your school who've all reached out to us wanting to start a chapter, let us introduce you. Here's here's how we can help you move forward with this,
That's great. It's a great organization for people to get involved with. I recommend checking out ssdp.org for more information. And where are you taking this? How long do you think you'll keep going with SSDP, and what's next for you?
Oh, well, it's hard to tell, because I love SSDP. I don't see certainly my relationship to SSDP ending at any time. I love the work we do. We have this great alumni network. So I think as far as that goes, you could see me still involved for a very long time. As far as being on the board goes, I've got, my term's still going on. I feel like I have a lot more work to do, and we'll see where that goes. But as far as I can see, as long as there is a drug war out there, as long as people are being thrown in cages for nonviolent acts, I think this is work that I think is vital, and I will continue doing.
Well, we're glad that you're doing it, Kat Murti. If people want to get in touch with you, do you have an email address or Facebook, anything you'd like to let them know about?
Sure. Actually, the best way to get in touch with me is on Twitter. I'm at Kat Murti, K-A-T, last name M-E-R-T-I. MURTI.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us here on A Sensible Future.
Great. Thank you so much, Russ.
This episode was produced as part of the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville, the daily news and interview podcast covering the world of medical cannabis, adult marijuana, industrial hemp, and spiritual ganja. MJAgenda.com.
The Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville is brought to you by Cannabis Kamikaze, a professional licensed producer from Canada producing 3 pounds per light. Follow Cannabis Kamikaze on Twitter at Cannabis Kamikaze. That's at Cannabis, Kamikaze. Cannabis Kamikaze.
You're not high. You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
And one of the parts of the American dream is we're going to come down very, very hard on this massive drug problem.
Okay, maybe you're a little high. This year in the United States, the opioid overdose crisis will take over 60,000 American lives. The use and abuse of alcohol will claim over 90,000 American lives. But the government still wants to crack down on Americans who smoke marijuana, which has never killed anybody. If this were a war and the enemy killed 150,000 Americans, would we go invade some country that had nothing to do with it? Wait, don't answer that. Skip that part.
Health Cannabinoid, your ACMPR experts. Consultation services for medical cannabis. Visit healthcannabinoid.com or call 1-800-906-1383. That's www.healthcannabinoid.com or call 1-800-906-1383. Health Cannabinoid.
Total war against public enemy number one.
10 federal criminal penalties for up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
Marijuana is probably the most dangerous drug.
Legalization is just another word for surrender.
I experimented with marijuana and didn't inhale.
This is not medicine. This is a Cheech and Chong show.
Encourage people to use less drugs.
I am here. That was the point.
I think it would be a mistake to legalize.
Negative reports coming out of Colorado.
Good people don't smoke marijuana.
Radical rant.
Since the legalization of marijuana here in the state of Oregon, the Oregon medical marijuana program has undergone many, many changes. And there's a number of reasons for that. But today I just want to focus on what the rules are today, because I was given a task. I was asked to look at the new laws that had passed thanks to a bill. I think it was Senate Bill 1057, I think is the number, recently passed here in the state of Oregon to change the grow site limits for medical marijuana growers. Okay, so this has nothing to do with recreational legalization, but it is somewhat in response to recreational legalization and to a few high-profile situations in the medical marijuana program. But the problem is that I was given this task to tell people what the new rules are, to design some sort of flowchart for it, because the language is so confusing, and the people at the state of Oregon themselves in the health department, the medical marijuana program, don't really seem to know what the hell is going on, and have given conflicting reports to people that have inquired about this. So I was asked to write up this flowchart. And after I read this bill and tried to read all through it, I wasn't sure I knew what the rules were. Now, it's interesting because we have a situation in Oregon where a medical marijuana patient can designate someone to be their caregiver, as well as designate someone to be a person responsible for a marijuana grow site. Now, the way this, or we're just going to call him a grower. The way this evolved was because originally you thought, all right, patient can grow their own medical marijuana. Well, some patients can't. They're disabled. They don't have the wherewithal to be able to cultivate cannabis. So, we'll have a caregiver. Someone can be a caregiver that can care for that patient grow plants for him. But then we realized you had to have a caregiver to protect oftentimes a spouse that was living with a patient, but perhaps that spouse doesn't know anything about growing cannabis, or the place where the patient and the spouse were living wasn't a place you could grow cannabis. The landlord wouldn't let it, federal housing, whatever. So they evolved that third level, the grower, so the patient could designate a third party who is not their caregiver, who could then grow cannabis for that patient. Now, this originally it was 3 plants and 4 immature, but most recently, since the past decade or so, the limit had been you could grow 6 plants per patient, and you could have 18 immature plants per patient. One of these growers could grow for 4 patients. So, one grower could conceivably grow up to 24 mature marijuana plants, 2 dozen, 6 times 4, and up to 72 immature plants, again, 4 patients times 18. That's the way it was for years and years and years. But then people found a little loophole. And this loophole was, while a grower could only grow for 4 patients, an address had no limit on how many growers could be there. So this led to a feature that was called card stacking in the community. That was, how many growers' cards and how many patient cards could they bring with them to one address? And then you could grow 6 mature plants for every single patient card you had there. This culminated in a high-profile story in which there was a farm in Southern Oregon that had 624 mature cannabis plants, for 104 registered patients. And the kicker was that none of those patients were from Oregon. Back in the day, we had no residency requirement. We were the only state that didn't have one. No residency requirement to get your medical marijuana card. People would come from all over the country and even the world to get their Oregon medical marijuana card. Even if it was just for show, even if it was just as a statement back at their home state, out-of-state patients would get their card. So unscrupulous growers took advantage of that too, stacked 104 cards from Southern California in a Southern Oregon grow site, and cultivated 624 cannabis plants. The resulting backlash from that has led us to where we are now, where they've gotten rid of they've added a residency requirement, which we think is unconstitutional, but we'll get to that sometime. They add the residency requirement. We're not going to have 104 Southern Californians with an Oregon garden anymore. That's in response also to the Cole memo and legalization. We're going to do everything we can to try to keep marijuana from going out of state. Well, you can't very well have a 104 patient garden for a bunch of Southern Californians if you want to follow the Cole memo. So they got rid of the residency requirement, and they started to figure out, how are we going to deal with this card stacking? How are we going to keep people from growing these massive cannabis farms? And also considered there's an angle of competition coming from the recreational growers who are like, hey, why should we jump through all these hoops, have to pay all these license fees, have to have all these inspections, security cameras, fences, etc., if the medical growers are just going to stack a bunch of cards and compete with us that way? That seemed unfair to them. So there's a lot of pressures going on here. So the original thought was, well, hell, we'll just limit how many patients there can be at a particular grow site. We'll make it a hard limit. We'll say you can have 12 plants if you're in the city. You can have 48 plants if you're in the country. Done. But then there was a backlash to that amongst the patient community, because the way things had evolved, even if there was the Southern California 104 plant grow site that was flaunting the loopholes and twisting the regulations, even though that was true, that doesn't discount the fact there was many compassionate growers who may have stacked 36 cards or 24 cards or however many cards at their address, but they weren't doing it to ship it out of state. They weren't doing it to profit. They weren't doing it for any big commercial venture. They're legitimate growers. They're legitimate, compassionate medical growers who were supplying massive amounts of plants and product and to be turned into oil for cancer patients, for example, where you need a whole lot of flour to make a little bit of oil. So these were the people for whom the medical marijuana program was designed. Compassionate, caring, altruistic caregiving growers. But the bad apples spoiled the bunch. These guys that took advantage of the medical regulations and the loopholes made it so, well, we got to crack down on them. And now the crackdowns on them became crackdowns on the good guys. So that led to this latest round of bills, in the 1057, the culmination of this, to say, okay, here's what we'll do. We'll make a new limit that's a hard and fast limit to keep from having mega medical grows. But for those of you who were growing back in the day, we'll set it up so that you can have more, or at least as you won't lose any patients. Because that was the big deal, is that like, okay, I'm supplying 24 patients, and now they're going to cut me down to 4. Which 20 cancer patients and MS patients and AIDS patients should I tell, sorry, you got to find a new grower? So that was what they were trying to solve. And that leads us to this chart over here. Oh, my God. So this is the flow chart I finally came up with. So number 1, in Oregon, you can only have 6 mature plants and 12 immature plants per patient card. Hard limit, regardless of everything else below that line, you can only have 6 mature, 12 immature per patient max. Now, it's not a hard limit. It's not a minimum, right? It doesn't say that if you've got 4 patients, you have to grow 24 plants. Hell, you could have 400 patients and still grow 6 plants or 2 plants if you wanted. The maximum is what we're talking about here. If there's 4 patients, the max could possibly be 24, subject to everything below, and we'll get to that. And we also still have that law that says you can only have 4 patient cards per grower, but no limit on how many growers per address. And that's where the flow chart below comes in. This is what you have to actually go through to figure out how many plants you're allowed to grow at a particular address. Is the grow site for just one patient? Whether it's the patient growing, the caregiver growing, a person responsible for a marijuana grow site growing somewhere else, the patient growing at their own house. If it's just one patient, you're limited to 6 mature plants, 12 immature. Oh, and by the way, we don't have the height limit 12-inch rule anymore in Oregon, so it's immature is a non-budding plant. But what if the grow site's for 2 or more patients? Well, that's where we start getting into this muddy area in gray over there of whether or not a site can be grandfathered. And the cutoff date they're picking here is January 1st, 2015. So was this a grow site? This address we're talking about, was this a grow site that had been registered and had been continuously growing before 2015, like all the way up to December 31st, 2014? If not, then you're subject to the hard limit. That is, if you're a grow site that was established after January 1st, 2015, then we have to decide, are you in a city and in an area that's zoned residential? Both have to be true. In a city and zoned residential. If that's true, you're limited to 12 mature plants, 24 immature plants. But again, that's with 2 or more patients. If it's just one patient, you don't get 12 plants. You're stuck with 6 and 12. But if you're in a city and it's residential, you get 12 mature plants, 24 immature plants. You have to have at least 2 patients to get those 12 mature plants. 2 times 6. You could have 3 patients. You could have 4. You might be just growing 1 mature plant for each patient. 12 patients. Doesn't matter. Your max is 12 and you got to have 2 patients. But what if you are not in the city, or you're in the city, but you're not in a place that's zoned residential? Maybe it's industrial area. Well, then you're allowed 48 mature plants and 96 immature plants. However, you're still subject to that top line, 6 per patient, right? So to get to that 48 max, you'd have to have 8 patients, which would mean you'd have to have at least 2 growers. It's complicated, huh? Right? 48 mature plants. Now, this 96 immature plants, as far as I'm reading the statute, now I want to get some clarification on this, but as far as I'm reading the statute, these limits per patient apply to mature plants. If I'm reading it correctly, the immature plants, that's a maximum that's allowed regardless how many patients you have. I could be wrong on this, but the way I'm reading it, If you had 2 patients at a grow site in the country, you'd be limited to 12 mature plants, 2 times 6, but you could still have up to 96 immature plants. Now, the statutes are written there. That's Oregon Revised Statute 475B.428, subparagraph 4A. Look it up yourself and tell me, but the way I'm reading it, it only applies to the mature plants, not the immature. But what about this whole grandfathered thing? Well, let's go back. If your grow site was grandfathered, if it was in existence before 2015, has the grow site ever been revoked? Has it been revoked since 2015, right? Like it was a grow site from 2010 to 2014 through 2015 through 2016, but in 2017 it got revoked. Tough luck, you're back to the new limits, 12 or 48, depending on if you're in the city. But if that's not the case, if your grow site was growing before 2015 and has not been revoked, so it's been continuously growing since 2015, then we ask whether or not your grow site's in the city and zone residential, has to be both. If so, you may keep your pre-2015 limit up to 24 mature plants and 48 immature plants. So this is where it also gets confusing, right? So you're like, oh, I got this grow site in the city. It's grandfathered in, and therefore I can have 24 plants. No. Not if you didn't have 4 patients as of December 31st, 2014. You are allowed to keep the patient count up, the maximum number of plants you could have grown with that patient count up until December 31st, 2014. So if your city grow had 2 patients, it doesn't matter whether your grandfather did or not. Because your city grow up until end of 2014 had 2 patients, your max is 12. Your city grow up until the end of 2014 had 3 patients, your max is 18. Even though the new the new overall limit is 24, your limit is how many maximum plants you could have grown for that many patients as of December 31st, 2014 that were registered at your site. Still with me? Okay, what if the grow site has multiple patients? It's been growing since before 2015. It has continuously grown after 2015, but it's not in the city, or it's in the city but not in a residential area. Wow, well then you get your 2014 limit up to 96 mature plants and 192 immature plants. But again, limited to where you were at in 2014. If you had 10 patients, you're limited to 60, right? Because that's what you were limited to. The idea is to not lose any of the patients you could have grown for or any of the crop you could have grown for those patients. It's not to give you a higher limit than you had before. You don't get a higher limit than you had before. And in both those cases, in the gray section, in those grandfathers, where you get your up to your 2014 limit, if you don't have enough patients now to match what your 2014 limit was then, you still only get as many plants per patient, right? So let's say, right? I know this is confusing. You've got a grandfathered city residential grow. At the end of 2014, you had 3 patients. So your max is 18 now in this grandfathered grow. But let's say now you've only got 2 patients, then you can only have 12 plants. Can you go get a 3rd patient to get back up to your 18? I don't know. I don't know what the law is on that. I couldn't quite get my head deep into it. I worked an hour and a half on this. So the gist of this whole rant, to just really boil it down, is I'm a really smart guy. And I read legislation all day, like day after day, every week. I'm reading legislation from multiple states and some foreign countries. I've been embedded in this Oregon medical marijuana program, either as a patient, a caregiver, or a grower, almost continuously since about 2003 or 4. And this was hard for me to figure out. I had to go back. I had to write like little notes and flowcharts and arrows on the page and going, okay, so this refers to that paragraph, which refers to I had to do that. And you're talking about getting some vet with PTSD, maybe a traumatic brain injury, to try to understand this, or an old lady with multiple sclerosis, or a guy who's just a gentleman farmer trying to grow for 4 patients. They're supposed to understand this. And to get really right down to the heart of it, why do we bother counting medical plants anyway? Why? We don't want diversion. I understand the Cole memo and the complaints from the recreational side. We don't want unfair competition. We don't want diversion. I understand all of that. But shouldn't we presume first that medical grows are for medical uses, and then bust them if we catch them selling, if we catch them diverting? That is to say, why do we have a per se number of plants that says above that limit you must be cheating? That's not helping patients any. And when we set these per se limits on certain numbers of plants that you got to have in this medical side, the only people it can hurt are the most desperate patients, the ones that do need the ounce a day, the ones that do need the massive amounts to create oils, the ones who are taking FECO every day just to beat cancer, just to live. They're the ones that get trampled by this. You think the guys that are trying to do the loopholes on the medical program are stuck by this? If the guy had been loopholing this since 2005, let's say, and had his 12 patients, he had stacked 12 cards so that he could grow 96 plants and a whole bunch of immature plants in veg, so that he could give his patients an ounce here or there and then amass the rest of it and ship it east to the black market. That guy can still do that under these laws. If he didn't get caught, if all his patients were Oregon patients and there were 12 of them, he had the right to, he and another grower and however many growers it would take to card stack, but you could have had a 96 plant grow under the old laws, under the old loopholes, gotten away with it, shipped that stuff east, made a ton of money. They can go through this little chart here and answer yes to all those questions necessary, or answer the right answer to all the questions necessary to get yourself down to that 96 mature plant level. They can still do that. These laws meant to crack down on the medical side. Don't harm the black market any, don't help the recreational side any, and only harm the most desperate patients who need this stuff. Let medical be free. Let it just grow. Let them give away weed. Let them grow as much as they want. Let medical undercut all this recreational. Let it be the market force that pulls that price down, that pulls all that down. Why? It's so frustrating. And on all this, this grandfathering in that we're doing, what does that really accomplish for anyone at this point? It's like, well, you can have 12 plants on this side of the road because it's a residential, but on this other side of the road where the zoning is now industrial, you can have 4 times as many? Because if you're in an industrial area across the street, we can trust you with 4 times as many plants. You're not going to be selling them on the black market if you live across the street. Does any of this make sense to anyone? I'll follow up with you on some other of the changes in Oregon's program, like adding another $480 fee to these people on top of $200 to get the card as a patient, on top of $200 to name someone else as your third-party grower. We'll save that rant for another time. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, take care of each other, tokers.
Follow MJ Agenda on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, YouTube, and follow MJ Agenda Show on Twitter. Learn more at mjagenda.com.
you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant